Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 1306. Today we're going to be talking about westward expansion. This is something that is already an ongoing trend when we pick it up in American history. We're going to be looking at the later half of that expansion, what's happening at the end of the 19th century. So really the focus for today is to look at who's moving west, why they're moving west, what the government is doing to promote westward expansion, and how various groups and people of diverse backgrounds are going to be interacting and dealing with one another when they're out west. So, very first sort of thing we need to talk about when we address this subject is what had already happened in American history. This is an important part of the subject here because most of the acquisition of Western land happens before our class even picks up. It starts with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 when Jefferson buys the large middle section of the country, more or less, from the French and from Napoleon. Then we have the Mexican-American War between 1846 and 1848. That politically is going to add what we call the American Southwest and parts of California into the United States. So when Mexico loses that war with America, they're forced to cede their territory in New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California, Colorado, Nevada, Utah. All that used to belong to the Spanish, and then after them, the independent Mexican government, and it was taken by America with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Just at the beginning of the Mexican-American War, Britain and the United States work out a treaty that fixes the northern boundary line between the United States and Canada. That's known as the Cession of Oregon Territory or the Oregon Treaty in 1846. That's how America gets the Pacific Northwest, Washington State, Oregon, areas like that. And so that is politically how the United States came to acquire all this land. But acquiring land and figuring out what to do with it are two really different ball games. And a lot of what was happening with America earlier on is we're buying all this land or purchasing it, we're acquiring it. The Spanish are going to be forced to cede Florida in 1818. Kind of 1818 to 1821. There's ongoing negotiations there. We have the cession of parts of Minnesota. We have the cession of all these territories out west. It's all there on paper, but the problem that America really faced up until a certain point was there was no way to expand because they were ready to tear themselves apart, the existing territories of the U.S., in the Civil War. So all this land is acquired throughout the 19th century, but America's not able to do much with it until the midst of the Civil War and then immediately after the Civil War when that fracture's finally happened and the country is able to put those regional differences aside and start focusing on a unified plan for westward expansion. So we're looking solely at expansion from 1860. And the first major act that was put forward by the American government was put forward in 1862, right in the middle of the Civil War. So this is known as the Morrill Land-Grant College Act of 1862. What this act does is it provides public lands to universities that specialize in agriculture, mechanical, or technological research and education. Put very simply, what it's trying to do is establish a bunch of schools that actually meet the needs of westward migrants. Somebody who moves out to a farm in Nebraska doesn't really need to know ancient Greek philosophy. They need to know how to fix their tractor. They need to know what crops to plant and how to cultivate them. They need more practical knowledge than that. And so it's through the Morrill Land-Grant College Act that we see the emergence of what they call agricultural and mechanical schools. And they start popping up mostly in the Midwest, the American South, and then the far American West. Actually, my alma mater in Michigan State University is really the sort of model for all of what they call land-grant colleges. Back in those days, it was called Michigan Agricultural College, and it was established right near Michigan's capital in Lansing. So the town is now called East Lansing. They serve as a model. The school there in East Lansing is going to be the model for all of the other A&M schools that come after it. On a funny little side note, it's eventually going to become Michigan State University, and I actually posted some pictures there of what is known as Morrill Hall. It was originally called the Women's Building at the Michigan Agricultural College, and then it converted to Morrill Hall. sometime in the 20th century to honor the fact that Michigan State was one of the first universities on which this idea of an agricultural college was modeled. And I've given you a picture of my old office there, which was called Morrill Hall. It eventually sunk into the ground and they had to tear the whole building down. So that's fun. They built a parking structure and then part of the building collapsed into the ground. So that's what the Morrill Land Grant College Act was all about, was establishing schools that met the educational needs of these migrants who are moving out west. People moving out west have practical needs, and those are being met by these new universities. So, despite the fact that America had acquired a lot of this westward land a lot earlier in the century, there was really no uniform effort to put people into these territories. And up until 1860, most of these settlers are moving westward on their own on a piecemeal basis. There was not a lot to promote the movement of people out to this region. And that's something that President Lincoln, again in 1862, he's going to look at. In the midst of the Civil War, he's already thinking, as we found out in Reconstruction in our last lecture, he's already thinking about the end of the war. And he's seeing this opportunity for westward expansion because he knows when the war comes to a close, this issue of slavery is not going to be threatening westward expansion. Because that's really what the argument was always about in American history in the 19th century. It was rarely about whether or not slaves should be allowed in Alabama or whether they should be illegal in New York. Nobody was really arguing that. What they were arguing about was every time we get one of these pieces of land, now we have to figure out if that's going to be a slave state or a free state, and nobody could agree, so we didn't really settle the territory. And so with that in mind, Lincoln looks towards the end of the war and says we need more people out west, and they pass the Homestead Act in an effort to promote people to actually move to the west. What the Homestead Act does is it guarantees 160 acres to those people who are willing to move out west and try to improve the land. So there's a few rules tied to this. Settlers have to occupy the land for at least 5 years. That's the deal. And they have to build on that land. They have to put up a farmhouse. They have to build a barn. They have to build a windmill, some sort of permanent structure that shows that they're investing their time and their money into improving this territory, this land. And so after 6 months under the Homestead Act, a settler could purchase their land outright from the U.S. government for $1.25 an acre. Now, at that point, that's not super cheap, but it is affordable to the common man. It's not something that's going to prevent the average American citizen from buying a large tract of land and trying to make a go of it as a farmer, or at what this point in time they call a homesteader out west. So, the success of this legislation was varied. It really depended on where you were talking about. Homesteads in Nebraska flew off the market. People were rushing, falling over themselves to go settle in a place like Nebraska. Naturally, it's going to work well there. It's an agricultural territory. It's the breadbasket of America. But it doesn't work the same way in New Mexico or Arizona, right? If I say, hey, move on out west and plant a farm, you're going to be really inclined to do that in a place like Nebraska or even in some of the upper plains states like territories like Montana or Wyoming, where ranching is a possibility. But really, when you're talking about the arid, dry, horrible southwestern deserts of New Mexico and Arizona, nobody's going to want to move out there, and they don't care how cheap the land is or how it's been subsidized by the government. So the Homestead Act, the outcome of it or the significance of it is that you have sort of big numbers of people moving to arable, lucrative areas. And certainly this part of Texas falls under that sort of label. This part of Texas is heavy in homesteading, all of Texas really, until you start getting out into the more arid regions of the West. And so those places are all going like gangbusters and people are moving in large numbers, but the deserts and the other outlying areas, not so much. They're going to remain rather unsettled. People just don't want to try to make a life out of the desert sort of climate and geography. So, the other major act that we're going to see passed is the Pacific Railway Act in 1862. This, again, is meant to promote westward settlement. We own the lands. We've got to figure out how we're going to get people out there. So Congress passes the Pacific Railway Act in 1862. What this does is it funds the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. And this would lead to a far larger number of people moving out west. Nobody really wants to pack up a wagon and walk alongside it for a couple thousand miles until they get out to Oregon or California anymore. That was a process that really came to an end earlier in the 19th century. Now, if you want people to move, you got to make it affordable and you've got to make it easy. And the Transcontinental Railroad does both those things. To be able to purchase a ticket on there would be affordable, and then it's going to take you all the way from basically the sort of end of the Midwest, the area right around, like Iowa and Nebraska, that region, and it's going to go all the way out. Basically, it starts in Omaha, Nebraska, and one company, the Union Pacific Railroad, is going to build basically railroads that connect from Omaha all the way up to the middle of the Rocky Mountains. And then another company would come along, the Central Pacific, and they start building from California, and they build back eastward. And they're going to build railroad tracks going through the Sierra Nevada mountains into Utah. These two railroads would meet up in Utah where they placed a golden spike to commemorate the finishing of this railroad in 1869. But from 1869 forward, now you can get on a train in Omaha, Nebraska, and you can be at the Pacific coast in a reasonable amount of time. And so you're not talking about having to basically pack up everything you own and move west by foot or with a horse-drawn carriage or something of that nature. So the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad is one of the darker episodes of America's past. The railroad was built mostly with immigrant labor. And as you just heard, there's two actual railroads being built, one moving from east to west and one moving from west to east, where they meet up together in Utah. And so two different types of laborers, for the most part, are being used to build these railroads. The one that's being built from west to east is being built mostly with Chinese laborers. They were very poorly treated by the companies that employed them. They were paid less than their white counterparts who were working on the railroads, and they died in incredibly large numbers. This is a dangerous sort of endeavor. These are guys who are up on mountainsides using dynamite. This is not a safe job. They're up there with pickaxes. They're digging out soil. They're laying down railroad tracks. There's, the story of one of the early medical breakthroughs actually came from a railroad accident. This is my cat Skeets' favorite history story. There's a guy actually who's helping to build this railroad who goes and he tries to drive a stake into the ground, and the stake actually comes back and shoots up through his head. The guy is walking around with a big metal stake sticking out of his head, and this actually led to some really early discoveries about how the brain works and how it's sort of sectionalized, because this guy was able to still function and live his life with a railroad spike sticking out of his head. They were able to cut it, but they couldn't remove it. And so they started doing early experiments into the brain, knowing that, well, it's got different lobes, different hemispheres. It's kind of but it shows you, just that one story sort of highlights, this is not a safe job. And so people are dying in large numbers as they're trying to lay this railroad down. On the other end, so you have Chinese laborers are being mostly used to build the railroad from the Pacific coast up to the Rockies. The other side is mostly being built by Irish laborers. These are people who had originally come in through the East Coast port cities, but there wasn't enough work in those areas. So they continued moving west following job opportunities. And they went out, and they also are poorly treated. They're often not paid very well for their efforts either, and they too die in great numbers while constructing these railroads. And it's important to understand that the Irish at this point in time are not seen as Caucasian people fully. There is an element of racism going on here that we wouldn't recognize today. So somebody like myself today, if you were to look at me, I'm of Irish descent, most of you would look at me and go, well, he's white. He's a Caucasian guy. That's what he is. And we include them in that group these days because that's how they're classified racially. Back in the 1900s, someone will look at me fresh off a boat from Ireland, and I'm not an Anglo-Saxon person. I'm not French. I'm not mainland European. I'm not Germanic. I'm not Nordic. I'm not Iberian. I'm Irish, and so it makes me Celtic ethnically. The thought process at the time back then is that the Irish and the Celts, as an ethnic group, were actually a sort of amalgam of African people, and Caucasian people. And that was sort of just the theory that they worked on back then. So Irish laborers weren't treated as white when they came to America, per se, not in the same way we would give them definitionally today. They were treated as outsiders. They didn't. They were mostly Catholic, so there was prejudice against their religion, and then also ethnically and racially, they weren't seen as being equal to other types of Europeans. They were seen as subhuman to them. And so there was no qualms about them dying in great numbers when they were building the railroads. So that's a big sort of episode of American history there, where you had this migrant labor has been conscripted to build this railroad, and they were treated very poorly. A lot of times they didn't get their paychecks, even though they put in hard days worth of work to build these railroads. And it's mostly Chinese and Irish immigrant labor that's building that. So when we think about westward expansion, we also have to pause and think very briefly about who's already living there. Clearly, these are not uninhabited lands, but as more and more American migrants start to move out into this area, they're going to be encountering a lot of different types of Native Americans in the Plains states and in the West. So, some of the tribes, clans, and nations that occupy the American West have been there for centuries, before Europeans started even arriving in the Americas. There's always this problem, and I like to address this early in the semester. There's usually a dichotomy in how we talk about different groups. When Europeans come into a territory and take it over, they're conquering the territory. They're invaders, they're outsiders, they're interlopers. When we look at Native Americans, we have a very static view of them that's not always very accurate. In the same way that Europeans came in and took over territory, Native Americans were doing the same thing too. Not everybody in the West was native to the West. Some other people have been forced there by the American government back in the 1830s, the Trail of Tears and Indian removal under Andrew Jackson. Those are groups like the Cherokee and the Choctaw, people living in the southeast of the country like Georgia and Florida. The Seminole are another group that are forced to migrate out to what at that point in time was called Indian Territory. Today we would call it Oklahoma. So you have those people living out there who are not traditional residents of the area. Their traditional homelands are in the southeast, but they were forced to migrate there by the U.S. government. You have other people living in the West who had recently come out and conquered it before Europeans had showed up. And so, really, I just want to remind you all that just because we're talking about non-Europeans doesn't make them any more justified, or I guess at least in many ways, that doesn't make them traditional inhabitants of the area. They're just as likely to have moved in within the last 100 years and kicked somebody else out who was living there before. But Native American populations west of the Mississippi River were estimated to be about 360,000 people living in roughly 500 tribes by the 1860s. And what this should tell you really is that we're looking at already a decimated people. The Native Americans living out west had been ravaged by disease, wars, forced conscription into labor. Most people are unaware that the colonial history of the Spanish in the American Southwest is incredibly brutal. We're talking about basically forced slave labor for Native Americans. They're being forced to convert by missionaries. And it's mostly the Spanish that they're coming into contact with out here, but they also have been in contact with Russians, with the French, with the English, with Germans. And all that contact with Europeans had led to an absolute displacement from their traditional ways of life. A lot of the groups that American migrants are encountering are at about 10% of their original population. And so they're coming into an area that's been badly fractured. And the proximity to Spanish influence had a big role in this. The closer these Native Americans were to the Spanish, the more likely they were to be forced into labor on Spanish projects, colonial settlements. And so the agricultural conditions of those areas also dictated whether or not the Spanish were even going to try to use slave labor in the form of Native Americans in those regions. And so the other thing is, if the Spanish were actively doing mission work in this area or proselytizing, these Native Americans were often being forced into religious conversion. But because of this, we're seeing the hastened spread of disease. Even if you weren't conscripted to work for the Spanish and somebody in your community was, by the time they were done working in a Spanish settlement, they were going to bring whatever disease they had been exposed to back into your village, and then the village would be ravaged by it. And so it really has the health of these Native American communities had to do with how close they were to Spanish settlements. The closer you were, the more badly ravaged your society really was. And then things didn't get any better when the Americans took over in this area either. But by that time, Native Americans were largely already sort of in this position of being marginal. Their numbers had already dwindled. Disease had already run rampant through their communities. Now, the Plains cultures, the Great Plains cultures that a lot of Native Americans in this region are going to have, there are some commonalities amongst them. They share a common belief in a general creator deity, but they also practice pantheism, animism, and ancestor worship religiously. They glorify the role of the warrior in armed conflict in society. And so that's going to mean that a lot of these groups are not going to sit there and tolerate westward settlement. They're going to fight back. And this is what's known as the Plains Wars, something that your textbook talks about. That's going on all the way throughout the latter half of the 19th century. That's where Custer and his men are being killed. That's where you have these constant wars between the U.S. military and armed Native rebellions. And so these groups are very, very big on warfare and cavalry use. They're big on horsemanship and horses. They use this to sort of equalize the conflict with with American armies. They're very, very good horsemen, and they're good at firing bow and arrows and guns off of horseback. So finally, these groups had well-articulated economies. They did practice some level of agriculture. They were hunters, they had tribute practices, pottery, toolmaking, tapestry, basket production, elaborate ornamental and art-based industries as well. So these plain societies are actually doing pretty well when Europeans start showing up out there. So they're going to be in conflict with a lot of the white migrants that come out because the white migrants are settling and the Native Americans see them as interlopers who are taking their lands. But it's not just white Americans that are moving westward. We also know that African American migrants are moving westward as well. And they're doing so in a lot of different ways. African Americans, in a lot of ways, are just trying to escape the post war South in large numbers because of what we talked about in our last lecture regarding Reconstruction, the imposition of Jim Crow laws, black codes, things like that happening in the American South. This led to a lot of African Americans saying, you know what, I'd rather be anywhere than here. The South is awful. It doesn't look much better in the West, but anything's got to be better than here in the South. And so these people, a lot of the African Americans who move out there, they frame their moves in biblical terms. They look at leaving the South as a type of exodus. They compare themselves to Israelites moving out to the promised land. There's obviously a biblical underpinning to the way that they see their exit from the American South and their movement out west. This is why the label that we give to African American migrants moving west is exodusters. They're moving out of this area and they're of the South, and they think that there's going to be liberation, not just physical, but also spiritual in the American West. And so that's something that they're actively moving out west to try to take advantage of. Now, the problem is that, as I will always remind you, the problems of the East move west with the migrants. African Americans some of them are finding great success in the homesteading endeavor. They're moving out, they're setting up large farms, and they're finding some level of success in independent agriculture. But they are the group that's going to ultimately benefit the least from the Homestead Act because it's African Americans who are getting homestead claims in places like Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas, these areas where agriculture is not going to be very viable. And they're not getting great claims in places like Nebraska, in places like Kansas, in places even further to the west in the Plain States where you can actually grow some food. And so because there's sort of a racial breakdown in who's getting the best lands, African Americans didn't have access to the most fertile lands out west. And because they were already quite poor, having recently come out of slavery when they moved, they also didn't have a whole lot of capital to buy big plots of land and set up successful farms on them. And so we can see that some of the racial prejudice that exists in the East is going to move west with African American migrants. So, another group of people that I've already kind of alluded to that are moving west are going to be white migrants, European-based ethnic people. And so here we're going to see Eastern, Southern, and Midwestern whites all moving west for economic opportunities. There are some identifiable subgroups within this that we can kind of point out within the larger demographic category. A lot of the movement out there, the migrants who go that way, are simply white farmers and laborers. They're not real well off in the South or the Midwest or the East, and they're just hoping that they can move out west and get a good opportunity to start a big farm in that territory or get involved in any of the other burgeoning industries we'll be talking about. So that's some of the groups. Other people are soldiers. A lot of the movement west, and this is true of African American migrants too. A lot of African American migrants move out west as part of the U.S. Army. And so they're moving out west and putting up forts. And most of the times they're building these forts to try to defend against Native American attack. And so among this group are a lot of former Confederates who had joined the Union Army. And they are looking to escape the Reconstruction era South as well because they don't like the changes that are occurring there. You also have, to a certain degree, the element of religious migrants. You have in particular one really notable group that moves out west during the 19th century is the Mormons. They originated in upstate New York. They moved to Ohio, where they were promptly kicked out. Then they moved to Illinois, where they were also kicked out. And they eventually escaped religious persecution in the East to go and establish their church in Salt Lake City, Utah. So the Mormons are going to be moving out, and they're facing a lot of persecution in the East for a couple different reasons. Number one, and probably the biggest one, is they are polygamists, and this doesn't sit well with other Christians in the United States in the 19th century. And so they're seen as being non-Christian and really sort of blasphemous in a lot of ways. So they're run out for those reasons of the East Coast, and then other reasons stem from the fact that this group is economically tight-knit. So large numbers of Mormons will move into a community and they help each other out. So when you look at Mormons, you don't often see poor Mormons. They're oftentimes very successful economically, and this creates resentment amongst the non-Mormon populations. So they're moving out there to try to escape religious persecution. And among the group of migrants, we also have what are considered to be ethnic and religious minorities. A lot of newly arrived European migrants, ones we already looked at were the Irish, but you're also having people move in from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, they don't speak English. That's not their native language. They speak Greek, or they speak Italian, or they speak Yiddish, or they speak Hebrew, because you do have a lot of Jewish people moving in, a lot of Catholic people who are facing persecution moving in. They leave the East Coast to escape that kind of prejudice and look for opportunities out west as well. We also have talked about Chinese migrants, and they're not really moving west, they're arriving in the West. By 1880, over 100,000 Chinese migrants were living in the western United States. A vast majority of them had moved over earlier, during the years of the gold rush, between 1848 and roughly 1855 is when we see the stem of gold rush migration coming in from China. Now, over 75% of these Chinese migrants lived in California. What happens is they're kind of the first ones on the scene during the gold rush, but then when everybody else starts pouring in, people from the East Coast, people from Africa, people from Asia, other groups from Asia start moving in, Australia. There's people all over the world come into California, and jobs and work it becomes pretty scarce. And so the Chinese laborers, because they dress differently, they speak differently, they follow different religious and worldviews, they're going to be a very clear target for other migrant groups moving out there. And they're competing over the same economic opportunities, and a lot of white Americans are going to heap a lot of animosity and prejudice on the Chinese laborers in this area. Now, The fact that of the matter is, you have all of these advertisements in the East saying that the West is home for millions of migrants. It's wide open. There's tons of space, tons of resources, tons of opportunities. They're promoting westward movement in the East Coast, but at the same time, they pass a key piece of legislation that I would definitely want you all to be aware of for your exam. That is known as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This is a really unique move for the US government. They actually ban all Chinese migration to the United States after 1882. And this is going to be something that will come up again. We will revisit this idea of what's going on with the Chinese Exclusion Act. But it's important to know that in 1882, the United States simply says, that's it, no more Chinese migrants are allowed here. So we're now going to turn our attention. We've seen some of the migrant groups moving out there. We're going to turn our attention to why they're moving in the first place. And there are four key industries that are going to emerge in the West. Building the railroad, as you've seen, is already one of them. Farming is another one. The Homestead Act promoting that kind of farming. Ranching will become big, particularly in this region of what at that time they would consider Texas to be the West. Ranching and cattle raising is going to be a big one. And then finally, we're going to have mining will become a major source of income out west. The railroad would create thousands of jobs for immigrant labor, and it improved the prospects of settlement greatly. In addition to moving people from east to west, the railroads are also going to be able to move agricultural products, mineral products, to the east, where most of the major international markets are. And so it's not good enough to just go out and do business in the West. You've got to be able to sell. And to sell, you've got to move your products back east or take them out to the West Coast. And the railroad is what's facilitating that. And because of the railroad, wherever you saw settlements around the railroad popping up, these generally became the cities of the American West. Places like Denver, Seattle. San Francisco is kind of a port city, but once the railroad connects San Francisco to other parts of the American West, it leads to a very rapid form of urbanization there as well. So farming is going to be the major industry of the American West. It's why most migrants are moving out there. People are trying to move and establish a farm for themselves, one that will be lucrative and profitable to them. American farming actually triples after the passage of the Homestead Act and the Morrill College Land Grant Act in 1862. Now, life on the farms out west, it's not easy. You've got to be juggling a lot of different considerations. Weather patterns would make or break your farm. Insects that would come and eat your crops, that's going to make or break you too. Volatile markets and international competition. Farm life, you put all this together, and farm life is not very glamorous in the late 1800s. So farmers are going out there and they're trying to compete. The problem is you have large farms and small farms. And the large farms are going to get bigger and bigger, and they turn into commercial enterprises. Meanwhile, the individual family farmer gets crowded out of the market. He can no longer compete. And it's conditions like this that led to the Grangers and Granger laws. What we're looking at here, these are groups that emerge in the latter half of the 19th century. And what they're really fighting for is they're trying to stop the banking industry and the large railroad industry from driving small farmers out of competition. Banks are not giving loans to me, the individual family farmer. They're giving it to the massive commercial farm that's coming up down the street. And so the commercial farm is getting more money, more capital, and they're growing. And they're taking my land over. And now I don't have a chance to compete in the agricultural sector. And so the Granger laws and Granger societies are meant to fight against this kind of prejudicial loan system. The railroads are charging cheaper rates to move big farm products than they are for individual small farm owners. And so they're trying to fight against the kind of corruption, bribery, kickbacks, things that are going on in the farming industry at this time. So they're another sort of key term that you'll want to know about. Ranching, as I mentioned, big industry in this part of the United States. This is going to revolve around longhorn cattle, which are mostly found here in Texas. But any kind of animal that's going to be involved in ranching was introduced by the Spaniards to Central America a long, long time ago during the Columbian Exchange. And cattle, up until that point, was used primarily for leather. And it's not really until the turn of the 1800s that we start to see Americans acquire a taste for beef. Up until that point, if you were going to eat meat outside of chicken or pig, it was mostly going to be goat. And so goat is slowly going to get replaced by beef as the sort of chosen protein product that Americans are eating. Cattle were being raised in the West, and then they would have to be taken on what were known as cattle drives to the northern markets, where they would then be slaughtered and their products would be sold. So these cattle drives were particularly popular, what they called long drives, in the early days of cattle ranching. But they become less and less necessary as the railroad infrastructure of the American South and West start to build out. When railroads started reaching more rural areas in Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma, it was no longer necessary to get all your cattle herded up and then march them all the way into these northern markets. But it's during these cattle drives that the cowboy and the image of the cowboy emerges. The cowboy is actually a rancher, and his job is to make sure those cattle get from where they are grazing and raised all the way to the markets where they're going to be slaughtered and sold without them wandering off, falling into a ravine, or some nefarious characters coming and stealing your cattle. That's what cowboys were really all about. And many of the people who actually were in this industry, who worked as cowboys, in the ranching circles the second half of the 19th century were Hispanic or African American. And so a lot of the iconic imagery that we think of surrounding cowboys is actually more tied to these two subgroups in the American demographic makeup than it is to white Americans. That whole cowboy culture is actually based on the habits and the activities and the dress of African American and Hispanic cowboys who were heavily engaged in the ranching industry. So, moving right along, we have mining. Gold, silver, copper, lead, zinc, iron, all of these precious minerals can be found in abundance in the American West. You're probably familiar with the gold rush to Oregon country in Northern California in the 1840s. You may not know that there were big silver booms in Colorado and Nevada in 1859. And that starts what's known as the second mining boom out in the American West. But individual prospectors and miners from about the 1860s to the 1880s, just like in the ranching industry, just like in the farming industry, they're going to be driven out by big mining consortiums, large companies. They simply can't compete with the resources and the loans that these companies are getting from banks. But one interesting thing about mining is that it devastates the American West in terms of the ecology and the environment. This is a very boom bust industry. And what happens is you'll see somebody hits some precious metal, and then all of a sudden everyone flocks in, a town grows up around it, and then you just rip at the land. You tear it up. Mining almost always destroys the land, it leaves big scars, lots of pollution. The riverways are tainted moving forward. And so these people come in, they dig all the precious minerals out of the ground, and now there's nothing left, and they abandon it and they leave a ghost town in their wake. That's why you find all of America's ghost towns are in the American West. In addition to that, when you have this rapid kind of rise of a city out there, it leads to social problems emerging too. Alcoholism becomes a major problem in the boom bust mining towns of the American West. Prostitution becomes a major problem. Crime, violence, all of that. When we look at the environmental impact of all of this on the American West, we see depletion of nutrients and soils happening all over the place. There's an overall decline in the fertility of soil because lots of people move out, and not just people, but people who kind of don't know what they're doing when it comes to farming. They're leaving the East Coast and going, well, let me see if I can make a life for myself as a farmer out in the Great Plains. And so they cut down all the forests to clear the land, and they continuously plant crops that they don't understand. And it leads to soil erosion, so that 20 years down the line, the soil's dead. You can't grow anything. And so then they go, I don't get it. I used to have a very lucrative farm, and then all of a sudden it went bust. Yeah, because you didn't till the soil properly. You didn't give it a chance to recover. You didn't give a chance for the nutrients to come back. You pulled everything out of the ground and you sold it at market, and now I've got a bunch of dead soil I can't do anything with. So that's a major problem. The growing populations of the American West crowded animals out of their natural living scapes. You're probably familiar with the narrative that the buffalo were almost hunted to extinction as people moved west. You also have animals in the Pacific Northwest like beavers and otters that are prized for their furs. They're almost driven to extinction by human hunting. This is a big problem because Native Americans living in these territories that are having to live side by side with these new American settlers, they rely on a lot of these animals for their livelihood. And so this threatens their society as well. And then finally, the mining tactics of this particular time period just destroyed the natural terrain. You have open pit mining required the absolute and total destruction of any surrounding forests. Hydraulic mining tainted all the riverways and waterways. Every type of mining that they practiced out there left giant scars and gouges in the earth. And so we're seeing a major, massive environmental impact that's going on in this particular land. So that is the major economic trend that's going on out west. People are coming in and trying their hands in all these new industries, but the truth of the matter is small business owners, small farmers, small landowners are all being driven out. The big corporations are going to come and dominate the West, and the banks and the railroads are all complicit in this pattern sort of playing out. So with this new land, we have old conflict, and the Native Americans have been fighting white settlers since the colonial period. So this is certainly nothing new in American history. But the frontier areas are going to take on a new identity. What's happening is Americans had long always said, well, as we expand, we can just expect the Native Americans to go westward. But guess what? There's no west anymore. They can't do that. The Pacific Ocean, the East Coast, everything from end to end, sea to shining sea, as they say, is under American governmental control. So the government started to sign treaties with the Native Americans so that they would have to stay within fixed boundaries, what they called Indian territory. Now, oftentimes the U.S. government would sign a treaty with a Native American group and then go, well, we got more settlers showing up and we need more land. So then they would kind of arbitrarily break these treaties as well. And so, white settlers generally moving out west viewed the Native Americans negatively. They saw them as savage, backwards, pagan people. They had inferior technological development, and they think that they had inferior moral characters to white people. So that's the sort of attitude white settlers are bringing out with them. The U.S. government is mostly concerned with moving the Native Americans to reservations by the second half of the 19th century. And they're trying to do this by the consent of the chiefs, but this isn't always easy to obtain this. Some chiefs are really astute and say, no, I'm not taking this terrible deal you're handing me. Other ones don't really actually speak for the entire group of people. A lot of the American government didn't fully understand Native American social structures and political hierarchies. So Native Americans, by this point in history, were dealing with inflated rates of diseases and sickness, inflated rates of alcoholism, because in order to get them to sign the treaties, the U.S. government flooded the reservations and the Native American communities with alcohol. And then they would owe the Americans a trade deficit, and they'd have to pay it back in land. They had fractured relationships with the neighboring tribes, and now they had no access to fertile hunting or agricultural grounds. And so essentially what the American government did is they penned the Native Americans in. And this is why the Plains Indians needed to engage in violent conflict. They lashed back out during an episode known as the Plains Wars. Despite all these treaties, you have this continued encroachment by white settlers and a constant feeling of distrust and frustration between white settlers and Native Americans. This would lead to a series of armed conflicts in the 1860s and 1870s known as the Plains Wars. Now, the two main combatants would be the U.S. military and then coalitions of different Native American warriors rising up against the U.S. Some examples are Red Cloud's War in 1866. That happened amongst the Sioux people and the U.S. government in Montana. It ends with the Treaty of Fort Laramie. You have the Red River War in 1874, the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, the Wounded Knee Massacre as late as 1890. These are all examples of the Plain Wars. And the Plains Wars are all about Native American frustration. They're being penned in on these reservations. There's not an adequate living arrangement for them there, and they're lashing out and trying to fight continued westward settlement. So, also in the far west, you have the Native Americans, but you also have what are known as Hispanos. You have the Spanish speakers of the far west, most of whom are descendants of Spanish colonists and Mexican settlers. They are still living in areas of the Southwest like New Mexico, Southern California, and many of these settlers raised resistance to the treatment of white Americans who are settling out in this territory. One example of this is the organization of Las Gorras Blancas, the Whitecaps. This is a group that would go and basically sabotage American expansion. They'd go to a ranch and they'd cut the wire fences so the cattle could escape. Just little things to undermine the white settlers in this area. And they were active all throughout the 1880s and the 1890s. Some Spanish speakers were very prominent in the establishment of Western states, but as the populations grew, they became second-class citizens. And so really what we're seeing is that Native Americans and Spanish speakers in this territory are going to be increasingly forced out of the power structures of that region, and eventually they're going to become second-class citizens living in that territory. So the final thing I'm going to be talking about today is the process of assimilation. And this is going to be the new solution to what they call the Native American problem at this time. As I mentioned, life on the reservations that the Native Americans had signed into by treaty process was absolutely dismal. The conditions there were horrible. And while most Americans didn't really care about the fate of Native Americans, there are a vocal minority of people who wanted to see this problem dealt with. They didn't like what was happening in the reservation setup. And so, due to this vocal minority, Congress would act, and they appointed a commission to study Indian affairs. This is later going to morph into an organization that you'll need to be familiar with, the Indian Affairs Bureau. They're going to be responsible for a lot of our course and dictating and deciding what happens to Native Americans living in the U.S. So, politicians were actively lobbying at this point in time for the education of Native Americans in Western ways. This will become the sort of backbone of this idea of assimilation. Assimilation is actually goes all the way back to Jefferson. He believed in assimilation too. But the American government starts actively enacting this process of assimilation in the latter half of the 1800s. So, assimilation is the belief that there are so few Native Americans actually still alive. When you compare their number to the millions of white Americans living alongside of them, the belief is that rather than trying to create space for them to live, trying to carve out a niche for their culture, or flat out going to war with them and destroying them, the easier way to deal with Native Americans would be to make them model themselves after whites, speak like white people do, speak English, become a Christian, wear a suit jacket and a shirt and tie and a vest and trousers. Get rid of your native customs, your native religion, your native speech patterns, all these things. If we get rid of that element of Native American society, they're eventually going to be educated just like white people. They're going to marry into white families. And within a few generations, Native Americans will no longer exist. That is what assimilation is all about. They're going to be assimilated into white American culture. And so, as part of this process, there is the passage of something in 1887 known as the Dawes Severalty Act. And so this was designed to break up the reservations, and what it does is it limits Native American authority on the reservations. Their kids are going to be forced into Christian white American cultural norms. What it would do is it would hold the act. Basically, the act holds the lands in trust for 25 years, and it puts a bunch of stipulations on Native Americans that says you have to do this or you can't do that. And what it's all about is the establishment of Indian schools. These Indian schools are the phrase that kind of dictates how they run is "kill the Indian and save the man." what they're going to do is they're starting in 1879. There's a school in Pennsylvania called the Carlisle School. That would be the model for every other Indian school in the U.S. Here's what they do. They take Native American children out of their homes, away from their families and their communities, and they send them to boarding schools. There, they're forced to speak English at all times. They're forced to wear Western-style clothing at all times. They cannot speak in their mother tongue. They cannot wear their traditional regalia. Most of the time, they're going to be studying the Bible because they're trying to turn them into Christians. And then finally, they're going to be forced to follow really harsh and rigorous standards of behavior. Sit upright, eat with your fork, put your silverware in this particular order. Don't slouch. All these different kinds of things. Children who didn't follow these rules would be punished with forced labor or beatings. And forced labor was kind of a common component of these Native American schools. And so this is the way that the American government is trying to deal with Native Americans at this point in time. They're figuring by this really forced and rigorous type of education, they can streamline the Native Americans into a mode of behavior that resembles white American culture, and then eventually they'll marry into white American families and they'll cease to exist. Native Americans will not be there anymore, and there will be no need to think about what happens to them, reservations, treaties, all this other good stuff. So that is the main mode of operation in terms of American governmental dealings with Native Americans in the West. So that pretty much wraps up my lecture. There are definitely some other subjects you want to read up on. My PowerPoint lecture talks a little bit about the myth and the imagery of the American West and what that's all about. It's largely a manufactured sort of image of this wild, roughshod, persevering, domineering life of the Westward man. It's really, I'll sum it up by saying the West was horrible. It was dirty. It was violent. It was unsettled. It was politically in upheaval. Everything was chaos. And the reality is that life was not that glamorous, not that glorious, but that kind of lack of structure does provide opportunities for people. And so people are still going to keep moving in. So definitely read the textbook chapter. Take a look through the PowerPoint lecture. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, demagoguery, diatribe, I'm here to listen to all of it. So feel free to shoot me an email or set up a Zoom meeting. Take care.